They were a young couple, madly in love.
He was just a very, very humble, very intelligent, sweet young man. They was talking about getting married.
But wedding bells would never ring.
We get a 911 call of accidental shooting.
It was hysteria. There was screaming. There was confusion on the line.
They said he was hunting.
Was it simply a tragic accident?
How do you accidentally shoot yourself in the chest?
I knew something wasn't right.
The story just didn't add up.
Or will the investigation reveal a tangled web of secrets and lies?
We believe that there was some type of sexual relationship.
There was still more hearsay than it was hard evidence of anything.
I knew that the truth wasn't being told.
We still probably will never know what happened.
October 16th, 2009. It's a fall Friday night in West Point, Mississippi. And almost everyone in this rural southern town is packed into the stadium at the local high school.
Friday nights revolve around football. They have a rich football tradition. They've been state champs now 4 straight years.
But that Friday night, not all the action is on the field. At around 9 o'clock, police radios around West Point all pick up the same urgent message.
We received a 911 call that there had been an accidental shooting.
The caller, 31-year-old Tamisha Shelton, tells dispatch that she'd heard a shot, gone outside, and found her sister's boyfriend, Danielle Young, at the foot of a tree outside her trailer.
I need an ambulance! My sister's boyfriend, I think he shot himself.
The caller was very hysterical on the phone.
Please, you have to hurry. I think he's still breathing, but he's really hurt.
Tamisha isn't the only one worked up over Danielle either.
What happened?
It was Katina Tutton, the younger sister of Tamisha and the girlfriend of Danielle.
She's upset and she's wondering what's happened. She's screaming this over and over again.
Where's the ambulance?
21-year-old Danielle Young was a Mississippi native who grew up on a farm 2 hours south of West Point.
He was a real country man. Hunting, fishing, he just loved the outdoors, getting his hand dirty.
Life was hard for a big family on a Mississippi farm, but Danielle never let hard times break his spirit.
Every time you see him, he'd have a smile. He was a good person. You know, anything you needed, you know, he was there.
He never met a stranger, helped anybody he thought was down.
When Danielle wasn't hunting or fishing, you could find him under the hood of a car.
Daniel liked to work on cars. He worked on cars a lot.
He was a mechanic out of this world.
Danielle turned his passion for tinkering with cars into a career.
He always talked about having his own car shop, having his own business.
After high school, he enrolled in an auto diesel mechanic school in Nashville, Tennessee.
He worked so hard while he was in school and he was graduated the top of his class. He had accomplished his goal of getting his degree in auto mechanics. I was very, very proud of him.
While in Nashville, Danielle not only became a certified mechanic, he also fell in love with a woman named Katina Tutton.
Katina was from rural Mississippi, just like Danielle, so they had a lot in common.
Katina went to college in Nashville, where she met Danielle as he was learning auto repair.
Katina was going to art school, and she was studying to become a commercial artist.
Danielle and Katina hit it off as soon as they met.
They fitted fine as a couple. She was quiet. She smiled all the time. He was really into her. He told me he really liked her and everything.
Danielle was always a person that loved that fun and laughter.
He was liked by everybody. He made everybody smile.
Soon they were more than just dating.
He knew that she was the one, and she was definitely in love with him. They decided to go and move in with each other.
But eventually, their time together in Music City came to an end.
He graduated, then he left and went to Louisiana with his older brother and worked a while down there with him.
He was working at a diesel shop.
With Danielle in Louisiana, Katina stayed in Nashville to finish school.
They didn't give up on their relationship. They really tried to make the long-distance thing work.
She was excited. She didn't want to give that up, but neither did she want to give up the love and her relationship with her boyfriend.
Danielle felt the same way about Katina.
He was head over heels in love with her.
They started meeting in West Point about every other weekend, which was a good halfway point between them, and where Katina's mother and sister still lived.
They both were making efforts to make this last. There had been conversations about Katina possibly moving somewhere closer so they could continue their relationship but not be so far apart.
Since Katina's mother wasn't comfortable with an unmarried couple sharing a bedroom, Katina and Danielle would stay with her sister, Tamisha.
Tamisha Shelton lived in a trailer just down the street from their mother's house.
So Shelton definitely opened her arms and opened her home to her sister's boyfriend.
Tamisha and her sister were very close.
A single mom, Tamisha was glad to have her sister around to lend a hand.
Tamisha was on disability for health issues she was having, and sometimes this included having seizures.
When she had graduated from college and wanted to move forward with her career, the seizures seemed to go and take over.
Danielle was happy to use his skill as a mechanic to pitch in as well.
Being from a small town, that's what we do. We kind of get in there and help one another.
However, on this particular visit to West Point, on the weekend of October 16th, Danielle was planning something special because it was Katina's birthday.
He was saving up to buy her a ring for her birthday.
And perhaps the ring was more than just a birthday present.
He was talking about he wanted to marry her.
He was making plans for his future wife and his life. He was making preparation for that.
But what was supposed to be a celebration has just become a tragic and chaotic scene.
He's not moving.
The initial phone call into 911 was from Tamisha Shelton. It was hysteria. There was screaming. There was confusion on the line.
Sirens converge on the home of Tamisha Shelton in an area west of town called Moon Valley.
Moon Valley is a good 15-minute drive.
You don't know where to go, you're gonna get totally lost behind those woods.
But when first responders arrive, there's a glimmer of hope for Danielle.
She was screaming Danielle and actually told the officers that she thought he was still alive.
In the fall of 2009, Danielle Young and Katina Tutton were looking forward to a bright future together.
They were both climbing the ladder and had plans to really and truly be together as a couple.
He was in love with her. He wanted to marry her.
But now, on the evening of October 16th, sheriff's deputies and EMTs are racing to the home of Katina's sister, Tamisha Shelton, where Danielle has just been shot.
Tamisha had called 911 around 9 o'clock and reported that Danielle had shot himself.
When sheriff's deputies arrive on the scene, they find Danielle lying on the ground outside Tamisha's trailer.
Mr. Young was face down on the ground underneath the tree out in the yard.
Standing over him is Tamisha Shelton and her sister, Katina Tutton.
Katina was screaming Danielle and actually told the officers that she thought he was still alive, that she heard some breathing, possibly gurgling, something.
Law enforcement did what they could to calm Katina down and remove her from the scene to allow the ambulance workers, the EMTs, to go in and treat Danielle.
They quickly realize that it's too late.
EMTs came in, and once they turned the body over, realized that Danielle, at that point, was already dead.
They don't have a pulse.
It appears that Danielle was killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest.
There was a hole that was visible in his shirt, but not very much blood at all on the actual garment. They, of course, cut the garment back, and there was an entry wound in his chest, but from the outside, it didn't appear to be that traumatic of an injury.
Detectives arrive and take charge of the crime scene.
When Ramirez Williams arrived, they found the .22 caliber revolver that was on the ground, very close to Danielle's body.
The caliber of the gun was consistent with the wounds in Danielle's chest.
But if it's the gun that killed Danielle, how was the fatal shot fired?
If this was an accidental shooting, theoretically it could be a ricochet, or it could be he dropped the gun and it discharged.
Was it an accident? Was it a suicide? Was it a homicide? What exactly happened here?
For the investigators, there's only one way to get to the truth.
We began collecting all the evidence we could. Our evidence that we gathered, including the weapon, was sent to the crime lab for examination.
Detectives are also careful to preserve any evidence on Danielle's body.
Traces of gunshot residue could show whether Danielle actually fired the shot that killed him.
They bagged his hands, where they put paper bags over and rubber band it in order to preserve any evidence.
While the coroner removes the body, detectives take Tamisha aside to find out what she knows.
She was still visibly upset. She was shaking. It was an emotional moment.
Tamisha tells the detectives that earlier that evening, Katina and Danielle had gone over to her mother's house.
The two houses were connected by a road. It was a short walking distance from each house to the other one.
But Tamisha says that Danielle returned to the trailer a little before 9 o'clock.
She said that Mr. Young had actually came to her window while she was getting ready for bed.
What do you want?
Then, according to Tamisha, Danielle had asked her for a gun to shoot a raccoon.
So she loaded a .22 revolver.
She felt like pretty confident that he was going to be comfortable with the gun.
She goes to the front door and gave it to him.
Tamisha tells detectives that Danielle had taken the gun and headed off toward a tree on the edge of the yard.
She closed the door and stayed in the house and didn't hear anything for several minutes.
Then, she heard a single gunshot.
What happened after you heard the gunshot?
Well, I was expecting him to come back to the bedroom door, but he never did.
Finally, after several minutes, she'd gone to the door to check on him.
Danielle!
She went outside and began calling his name, and that's when she discovered the body lying on the ground.
Tamisha says she'd run to Danielle's side and immediately realized he was in grave danger.
She was in shock, so she immediately called 911.
Tamisha tells detectives that while she was on the phone, her little sister arrived at the trailer.
According to Tamisha, Katina had showed up just moments after the shooting.
Katina's story matches her sister's account. once she's able to tell it.
It took some time to get her calmed down and being able to get answers out of her.
Katina tells the detectives that she and Danielle had been at her mother's house.
She said that when Danielle went back to Tamisha's trailer around 9 o'clock, she actually stayed behind to talk to her mother, who apparently kept a police scanner.
According to Katina, they actually heard the 911 call go out over the police scanner and ran down to the sister's yard.
If no one was with Danielle when the shot was fired, does that mean his death was an accident? The investigators aren't so sure.
How it would go from shooting up into a tree to shooting yourself in the chest. Listening to the information that we was be given by the sister, at that point, it just wasn't adding up.
Especially when the victim is an experienced hunter like Danielle Young.
I know definitely that he hadn't shot himself with no .22 hunting no coon, because that's not logical. I knew that the truth wasn't being told.
But if Tamisha and her sister aren't telling the whole story about the shooting, what could they be hiding?
Is it possible they didn't want to admit that Danielle fired the fatal shot on purpose?
There was talk of maybe he had committed suicide.
Oh my God.
Just hours after 21-year-old Danielle Young was found shot dead outside a trailer in rural Mississippi, investigators with the Clay County Sheriff's Department suspect the shooting was no accident.
So far, all they had to go on is what they learned from Tamisha Shelton, the sister of Danielle's girlfriend.
Her statement to the officers was that it was an accident, that he was trying to shoot a raccoon with the .22 caliber gun that she gave him.
But Tamisha didn't actually see the fatal shot being fired. And for investigators, some things about her story don't quite add up.
Young was an avid hunter. He understood the importance of being safe around a firearm. So having an accident would have been pretty far-fetched considering the experience that he had.
Did Danielle commit suicide? Investigators hope an autopsy will provide some answers.
Because Clay County is a small county with limited resources, the body was sent to the crime lab in Jackson for the autopsy.
While waiting for the autopsy report, investigators focus on their only potential witnesses, Tamisha and her sister, Katina Tutton, Danielle's girlfriend.
The second statement was taken at the Clay County Sheriff's Office later that evening around midnight.
Before the interview, the deputy in charge of the investigation uses a test kit to swab Tamisha's hands for traces of gunshot residue.
He had told the other law enforcement officers, don't let her wash her hands, don't let her go to the bathroom until we get there and are able to collect this.
Tamisha has also been told to bring a change of clothes with her to the station.
They collected the pajamas and bathrobe she was wearing at the time of the shooting so they could be tested for gunshot residue.
Our evidence that we gathered was sent to the crime lab for examination.
Tamisha gives detectives the same account she gave at the crime scene.
She said Danielle Young came to the trailer around 9 o'clock and asked to borrow her gun.
Tamisha again said that she had loaded the weapon for him and that he was going to shoot a coon that he saw out in the yard.
She again told him that she was inside when the weapon was fired.
What were you doing prior to the shooting?
I was taking care of my kids, cooking dinner, putting them to bed like I do every night.
Detectives pressed Tamisha about the relationship between Danielle and her sister, Katina.
Tamisha's explanation was it was like any other relationship with young people, that they had their moments where they fought and times where they got along great.
These were two young individuals who were ready to start their life together.
Tamisha also dismisses the idea that Danielle's death might be a suicide.
Is it possible that Danielle would have shot himself on purpose?
No, absolutely not. No way. Him and my sister, they were happy.
Tamisha said she'd know if they were having problems because he and Katina stayed at the trailer whenever he was visiting.
However, Tamisha does suggest one problem that Danielle and Katina were dealing with.
The only issue that they really and truly had was the distance. It was a long-distance love that they both shared.
Danielle was interviewing for jobs in different states.
They just couldn't figure out logistically how they would make it work.
Was there more tension in Danielle and Katina's relationship than anyone realized?
I really think you should talk to my sister about that.
The next morning, investigators interview Tamisha's sister, Katina, who's still struggling to deal with Danielle's death.
Katina had a harder time opening up and talking to them at that time because of the emotions of the moment.
Thank you so much for coming in to speak with us.
Of course, whatever you need.
Katina admits that sometimes her long-distance relationship with Danielle could be challenging.
They did have some verbal arguments. Basically, it was just boyfriend-girlfriend arguments.
The disagreements were about where they should live.
Their intent was to try to figure out a way to where they could, get closer together instead of being so far apart, trying to figure out a way to kind of close that distance.
But Katina denies having any sort of argument with Danielle the night he died. Certainly nothing that would drive him to suicide.
No, nothing like that. We were fine.
By all information provided to us from Katina, she and Danielle had a good relationship. He had been up to spend time with her and her family, and things seemed like they were going well.
Investigators let Katina return to her family to grieve, but questions remain. Did Danielle take his own life, or was there another explanation? When the autopsy results come in from the medical examiner, suicide becomes a less likely cause of death.
The first things medical examiners noted were the burns in the clothing around the wound in Danielle's chest, which is actually consistent with a self-inflicted wound.
It looked like it was a very close shot.
However, according to the ME, those results are only part of the story.
A shot to the chest is not very common with suicide. Typically, you'd expect to see a shot to the head, a shot inside the mouth. So this already was a little bit outside the norm.
But the most significant finding is the angle of the fatal shot.
The bullet passed directly through the body at a straight line. There was no deviation, a clean 90-degree angle.
For the medical examiner, the angle of the shot can only mean one thing.
This is not a suicide. This was more likely a homicide.
Less than 24 hours after Danielle Young died from what was initially thought to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound, the medical examiner has reached a different conclusion.
At first, it seemed possible that this was suicide, but the bullet entered Danielle's chest at a 90-degree angle, which is something that you never see with a self-inflicted wound.
It was a very close shot, but not done by his hand.
This is not a suicide, it is a homicide.
But if Danielle didn't shoot himself, who pulled the trigger? His girlfriend Katina was supposedly at her mother's house a few hundred yards up the road when the shooting occurred.
When police contacted Katina's mother, she confirmed that Katina was with her when they heard about the shooting on her police scanner.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you for speaking with me. We'll be in touch.
Her mother states that she's with her the entire time.
With Katina's mother providing an airtight alibi, the investigation circles back to the last person to see Danielle alive, Tamisha Shelton.
You're looking for motive, trying to find out what would have caused this to happen. When you're looking at the statements that the individuals was giving, you're comparing that to the evidence.
And Tamisha's account of what happened that night doesn't fit with what investigators are learning.
She told law enforcement at the beginning that this was an accidental shooting.
Since the evidence lines up more with a homicide, does that mean Tamisha is hiding something? At this point, detectives have to consider the possibility.
Detectives check into her background to see if there's any previous record of violence or criminal activity.
However, there's nothing in Tamisha's past that suggests she's a killer.
Police were never called out to her home. There were no incidents. There was no discussion of her being a violent individual or even having any type of altercation in the past.
There's also nothing to suggest that she'd do something so devastating to Katina.
She obviously loved her sister because she opened the doors to not only her sister, but her sister's boyfriend.
What could possibly motivate a law-abiding citizen like Tamisha to shoot her sister's boyfriend?
Once again, detectives are considering if this could have anything to do with Danielle's relationship with Katina.
Her sister was younger than she was, close to 10 years apart, but they stayed very close and they were very protective of each other.
Could that be the motive behind the murder? Had Tamisha shot Danielle to protect her sister?
The investigators checked into Danielle's past, and just as they did Tamisha, they found no evidence of criminal activity or violence, including domestic violence.
With nothing in Danielle's history, detectives reach out to his family.
Detectives make the drive to Forest, Mississippi in order to interview Danielle's relatives in person.
When detectives inform the family that Danielle's death has been ruled a homicide, they're hardly surprised.
I know my brother, he didn't have a reason to try to kill himself. And, when I first heard about it, I'm like, this can't be true.
Asked about Danielle and Katina's relationship, everyone in the family says the same thing.
They described it as things seemed like they were going well at that time.
His family talking about he wanted to marry her and that he was in love with her.
The family's equally sure that Katina loved Danielle. However, they also suspect she isn't the only one who had feelings for him.
There had been rumor that Tamisha, she had somewhat of a crush on Danielle. There was rumors that perhaps she had tried to hit on him.
According to Danielle's family, the accusations about Tamisha came straight from Danielle.
Danielle would tell them that, the thing that she was doing before him, as if, she had an attraction for him.
One day when he came into the house, she was on the couch with her lingerie on. Tamisha was trying to come on to him.
That still puzzles me to this day. Why would you cross that line with your sister?
It was a line Danielle's love for Katina wouldn't let him cross.
He said he didn't do that. He was like, he couldn't do that.
I always taught him, do the right thing.
Did Tamisha refuse to accept that Danielle was choosing her sister over her?
She know that Katina and he was talking about getting married. What did run through my mind was that if she couldn't have him, she wasn't gonna let anyone have him.
I think that's all the questions we have for now.
As certain as Danielle's family is, detectives can't make an arrest based on a suspected motive.
What they needed most was the results of the gunshot residue on Tamisha's hands and clothing.
Unfortunately, the crime lab has 82 counties they have to serve, You don't jump to the front of the line because you have a homicide. They're working dozens of homicides at all times.
While waiting on the results of the gunshot residue tests, detectives decide to put a little pressure on Tamisha.
Detectives ask if she'd be willing to come in and take a polygraph exam.
Tamisha agrees to take the test.
While they were waiting for the examiner to connect her to the polygraph machine, investigators sat down with her to get another statement.
So, when I do
Her story of what happened that night hasn't changed.
Tamisha was adamant that she was inside the home at the time the shot was fired, that this was an accidental shooting.
But in the middle of her statement, Tamisha makes a shocking admission.
Tamisha Shelton explained that she had fired the weapon.
She said there was a stray dog hanging around the trailer, so she fired the gun in order to scare it away.
Is Tamisha trying to cover her tracks?
The investigators thought that she may be worried about what the results of the gunshot residue test will eventually show.
The question she had was, this going to prove my innocence or my guilt?
2 days after the shooting of 21-year-old auto mechanic Danielle Young, investigators have brought in 31-year-old Tamisha Shelton for a polygraph examination.
Though the shooting appeared self-inflicted, the medical examiner has ruled it a homicide, and detectives considered Tamisha a possible suspect.
Suspicions only deepen when Tamisha sits down with detectives prior to taking the polygraph exam.
She raises the issue for the first time that she had in fact shot the gun. She claimed that she shot the gun on Wednesday, October 14th at a stray dog that was in her driveway.
That was a bit odd for her to come up with that.
On the 2 interviews the night of the shooting, Tamisha never once mentioned that she had fired the gun.
Investigators suspect the timing of Tamisha's admission may have to do with the gunshot residue testing of her hands and clothes.
She keeps trying to fill in gaps that she thinks will explain negative evidence.
Is Tamisha telling the truth? Or will the polygraph reveal that she's lying?
Once she went in to do the polygraph test, she was already nervous.
Investigators hope the polygraph will confirm or deny Tamisha's version of events. But just after they have her hooked up to the machine, Tamisha begins shaking violently.
Call an EMT!
Right before it started, she had an apparent seizure.
They had to stop her and she was taken to the hospital.
She wasn't there long, probably an hour or so, and then she was actually released from the hospital and allowed to return home.
Like her memory of firing a gun, the seizure strikes detectives as suspiciously convenient.
The detectives suspect that she may have faked the seizure because she was afraid of what the polygraph exam would reveal.
She never did take the polygraph.
Everything looked quite suspicious.
However, investigators are still a long way from making an arrest.
The biggest holdup in the investigation was the time it took in order to get the gunshot residue tested.
The Mississippi Crime Lab does an excellent job. Unfortunately, they're overworked. They have a number of cases that create a backlog, and it takes a long time for us to get evidence back.
The delay is frustrating for the investigators and agonizing for Danielle's family.
Although they laid their family member to rest, they still were not at rest. They were not at peace because all they had were more questions, no answers.
Sometime weekly, sometime monthly. Every few months, I've always called back to West Point to see what's going on.
We still had the faith. We had hope.
Finally, more than a year after the shooting, Investigators received some hard evidence when the gunshot residue analysis of Tamisha's hands and clothing comes back from the crime lab.
The clothing that Tamisha was wearing, which was a bathrobe, come back positive for gunshot residue. We thought that was very, very significant.
Even more significant are the results from Tamisha's hands.
According to the reports, Shelton was constantly wringing her hands and wiping her hands on her clothes, but they still found residue not only on the back side of her hand, but also on the palm of her hand.
She was adamant that that gun was only fired by her on October 14th, 2 days prior to this shooting. There wouldn't be gunshot residue still in her hands and arms 48 hours later.
There's only one explanation for the test results.
She ended up with gunshot residue all over herself and her clothing. The only explanation for that was that Tamisha was there at the time of the shooting.
With the test results in hand, investigators believe they finally have the evidence they need to file murder charges.
All the evidence was collected and presented to the grand jury.
Once the grand jury heard the evidence, they returned what we call a true bill. That means that she had been indicted for the crime of murder.
Shelton was indicted. She turned herself in.
But after her family raises $75,000 for her bail, Tamisha returns to her home and her life.
I honestly feel that she felt that she was free from paying for the crime that she had done. I believe that she had become comfortable with it.
Danielle's family can only hope she's wrong.
I was just hoping and praying that they just finally got her.
Will Danielle's family finally get justice? Or will a sister's loyalty set a killer free?
Tamisha and her sister, they were very protective of each other.
I think she would do whatever was necessary to help her sister.
In April of 2011, more than a year after Tamisha Shelton reported that her sister's boyfriend, Danielle Young, had shot himself, investigators in Clay County, Mississippi, have arrested the single mother on murder charges.
The arrest came after the Mississippi State Crime Lab found gunshot residue on Tamisha's hands and the clothing she had been wearing on the night of the shooting.
We didn't get all of the evidence back for almost 2 years, which is the explanation of why there was a long time period between the crime occurring and it actually being indicted.
The arrest is welcome news for Danielle's family.
It was a lot of pressure lifted.
But it also brings new anxiety.
They were concerned about what was going to happen at trial. None of them had ever been through anything like this. And one thing that his family had always told us was, we want justice done. We want to see this through to the end.
When Tamisha finally goes on trial at the Clay County Courthouse in West Point on July 14th, 2015, prosecutors figure they have an ironclad case.
I never had any doubts once the crime lab results came back that Tamisha Shelton did it.
The autopsy report that said the trajectory of it showed it to be consistent with homicide.
The evidence paints a clear picture of how Danielle Young died.
It was clear, despite what she told police, when Danielle came to the house that night, Tamisha went outside with him.
Hey, can I talk to you here for a second?
Of course.
What's less clear is why things escalated to murder.
The one thing that's missing is why. Why would Shelton kill Danielle Young? What was the motivating factor?
His family strongly believed then and strongly believes today that this was some type of love triangle involving Katina, Tamisha, and Danielle. I think that's the most likely explanation of what took place.
My feelings are that he rejected her, and she couldn't take rejection.
I feel like maybe she got mad or something because I can't see any other reason why she would just kill him. Hey.
Regardless of why, prosecutors assert after the shooting, as Danielle lay dying, Tamisha came up with a cover story, placed the gun under Danielle's body, and dialed 911.
All the information that law enforcement had initially came directly from Tamisha. And when she called into 911, she told them this was an accidental shooting.
Whatever was in Tamisha's mind that night, the jury never hears the theory about a romantic triangle.
Unfortunately, we didn't have good evidence that we could introduce that would prove that.
It's the one potential weakness in the prosecution's case.
Juries want a motive. Unfortunately, we don't always have evidence that we can present to explain it.
The only two people that know what happened happens to be Tamisha and Danielle.
When it's the defense's turn, Tamisha's attorney calls their star witness, her sister, Katina. On the witness stand, Katina makes a shocking claim.
She believed this was a suicide.
She tells the jury it wouldn't be the first time Danielle had tried to harm himself.
Danielle had attempted suicide when they lived together in Nashville. Her claim was that he took too many pills that he had been prescribed by a dentist.
Danielle's family doesn't believe a word of it.
I know my brother. He didn't have a reason to try to kill himself.
We knew he didn't kill himself. When they first came to us with that, we knew that wasn't true.
Under cross-examination, the prosecutor goes after Katina's claim.
There was no evidence to corroborate the story that Katina had told about him attempting suicide in the past. She admitted she didn't call for an ambulance, she didn't take him to the doctor, she didn't seek any type of help whatsoever.
But what will the jury believe?
After a week-long trial, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder.
For Danielle's family, the verdict is long overdue.
At times, I think they got frustrated that the system took longer than they were hoping it would.
It was a 6-year waiting period. No one should have to wait that long for justice.
However, there's no delay in sentencing Tamisha.
In Mississippi, at that time, 2015, murder only had one sentence, and that was life in prison with the possibility of parole.
Since Tamisha's sentencing, Danielle's family has begun healing through forgiveness.
If I could talk to her and help her, I would, to get through this. Because I know that it isn't easy there for her either. But what she done, justice has to be paid.
But justice doesn't make the family's grief any easier to bear.
The autumn chill of New England does more than freeze the earth. It locks away the darkest transgressions of the elite under a permafrost of systemic silence and institutional protection. In November of 1995, the historic brownstones of Boston's Beacon Hill stood as monuments to generational wealth, old money, and an unyielding social hierarchy, where the family crest was an absolute shield against the scrutiny of the outside world. This was an insular playground of high society galas, private banking boards, and ivory tower Ivy League legacies, where the inner circle dictated the rules of engagement, and the local police department knew exactly which doorbells not to ring without a direct order from the state capitol. But on the razor-sharp evening of November 12th, that entire ecosystem of privilege and unassailable safety was violently punctured by a discovery so gruesome, so clinical, that it threatened to drag the darkest underbelly of Boston's billionaire class into the harsh fluorescent glare of a public courtroom. A 21-year-old art student, working her way through a prestigious university by waitressing at a private club, stepped out of her evening shift, buttoned her wool coat against the biting Atlantic wind, and walked toward the train station under the flickering shadows of the historic city streets. She never stepped onto the platform, her bright, artistic future instantly extinguished in a subterranean nightmare of calculated predator violence that left no immediate witness, no digital trail, and no obvious motive other than the pure, sadistic exercise of total domination. The next morning, the city woke up to a reality that was fundamentally fractured, as a maintenance worker discovering a ruptured steam pipe in a secluded alleyway behind the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens stumbled upon a scene that would haunt the nightmares of New England investigators for nearly 4 decades. There, arranged with an unsettling, ritualistic symmetry on the cold stone pavers, lay the body of the young student, stripped of her personal identity, her clothing precisely folded and placed at her feet, and her hands bound with a highly specialized, military-grade nylon cord that suggested an operative with advanced tactical training. There were no defensive wounds beneath her fingernails, no signs of a desperate struggle against a random street assailant, and absolutely no biological fluids left behind on the surface of her skin, only a profound, terrifying surgical cleanliness that indicated a killer who operated with the calm, methodical precision of a trained technician. The local precinct went into an immediate, high-alert mobilization, cordoning off the historic alleyway with miles of bright yellow tape that fluttered violently in the winter gale, while hundreds of plainclothes detectives fanned out across the district, desperate to pull a single actionable lead from the stone architecture of the city. But the wealthy neighborhood offered nothing but closed curtains, polite deflections from private security guards, and a collective, protective amnesia that immediately choked the life out of the initial homicide investigation. Weeks bled into months, and the frantic, aggressive energy of the early search curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread that settled over the Boston art community like a permanent toxic fog, as the realization set in that a highly organized predator was navigating their world with complete invisibility. The case file grew dangerously thick with useless tips from conspiracy theorists, dead-end sightings of dark sedans speeding away from the district, and the frantic, heartbroken pleas of a working-class family that lacked the social leverage to keep their daughter's face on the front pages of the metropolitan dailies. Every time a young detective attempted to expand the canvas of the investigation toward the exclusive membership rosters of the Beacon Hill clubs, a subtle, unyielding institutional resistance would manifest, shifting personnel, losing critical interview logs, and burying the momentum of the case beneath a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. The bright yellow police tape was eventually removed from the alleyway, the posters on the campus bulletin boards tore, faded, and were plastered over by subsequent semesters of student life, and the name of the victim became a hushed, cautionary ghost story whispered in the dormitories of the city. It became the ultimate cold case, a permanent, throbbing wound in the history of Boston law enforcement that promised to never heal, a dark secret locked so deeply in the vaults of the past that everyone assumed the perpetrator had successfully taken the truth to a private island grave. For 31 years, that wall of silence remained entirely unbroken, a heavy, multi-million-dollar curtain of social privilege obscuring a horror that continued to walk the elite corridors of the city, completely untouched by the law. The original homicide detectives who had sworn to bring the students' family justice grew old, retired, and carried their bitter sense of systemic failure to their deathbeds, while a new generation of investigators inherited a stack of disintegrating, yellowed papers and boxes of physical evidence that smelled of dust, vinegar, and forgotten hope. But the march of forensic science is an unyielding, geometric progression, and the small, preserved fragments of touch DNA recovered from the military-grade nylon cord in 1995 held a biological code that the high society executioner of the past could never have anticipated. When a specialized federal cold case task force decided to re-examine the old evidence using the cutting-edge tools of investigative genetic genealogy, they didn't just break the case. They pulled a microscopic thread that threatened to collapse the social registry of New England's most powerful financial dynasty. The genetic markers did not point toward a transient, a repeat offender with a violent rap sheet, or a long-dead drifter who had passed through the train station on that fateful November night. Instead, the DNA profile pointed directly toward an ancient, highly exclusive family lineage deeply rooted in the shipping and banking fortunes of Massachusetts, narrowing down to the single, middle-aged son of an internationally renowned billionaire philanthropist. To secure the final, mathematically undeniable proof needed to execute an arrest warrant without triggering an immediate, high-powered corporate counterlawsuit, undercover operatives from outside the state were brought in to conduct an intensive, around-the-clock surveillance campaign on the suspect. For 3 tense weeks, the detectives shadowed their target through the high-end restaurants of Boston, the exclusive yacht clubs of Cape Cod, and the private charity galas where he moved with the serene, untouchable confidence of a man who believed his ancient sins were completely invisible to the modern world. That illusion of ultimate immunity came to an abrupt, spectacular end on a mundane Thursday afternoon inside a luxury hotel lobby in downtown Boston, when the suspect finished an expensive double espresso, left a brief tip on the marble counter, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, entirely unaware that his gilded life was about to be utterly destroyed. The disposable paper cup he left behind was seized within seconds by an operative sliding into his vacant seat, immediately bagged in a sterile container, and rushed under emergency police escort to a high-security state genomics laboratory. The comparison was an absolute, flawless match, a mathematical certainty of 1 in 10 billion that connected the cellular material on that espresso cup to the decades-old nightmare, exposing a predatory monster who had hidden for 31 years behind a wall of old money, high status, and divine social privilege. The revelation did not merely solve a long-forgotten cold case. It struck the city of Boston like a structural earthquake, transforming a prominent, highly visible pillar of the financial elite into an accused sexual predator and murderer overnight. The man who stood shackled beneath the harsh lights of the booking room was none other than Julian Vance, the 48-year-old heir to a multi-billion-dollar real estate and banking empire, a man whose family name was carved into the limestone facades of hospitals, library wings, and university buildings across the state. For over 3 decades, he had stood at the apex of high society, attending international economic forums, contributing millions to criminal justice reform charities, and toastmastering the very galas where the city's political elite gathered to discuss the rule of law. The shock turned to collective, boiling nausea across the working-class neighborhoods of Boston as the public realized that the man who had lived a life of unimaginable luxury was the very person responsible for the brutal, calculated destruction of a defenseless young student. Neighbors in the exclusive enclaves of Beacon Hill looked at each other with newfound terror, realizing that the phantom they had feared in 1995 wasn't a shadow from the slums, but a man who sat on their executive boards, shared their country club boxes, and drank vintage wine at their private dinners. As the news vans swarmed the historic streets of the city and the flashing blue lights of federal tactical vehicles surrounded the iron gates of the Vance family estate, the public was forced to confront a terrifying, unvarnished truth about the nature of power and accountability. The past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting for the technology of the future to catch up with the arrogance of the elite, and no amount of wealth, political leverage, or institutional protection can wash away the blood from a killer's hands once the digital ledger of DNA demands a full accounting. The immediate aftermath of the arrest turned the Boston courthouse into a chaotic theater of public outrage and disbelief, as international media outlets descended upon the city to document the spectacular, unprecedented fall of an American aristocrat. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was a war of absolute silence, with Julian Vance sitting motionless beneath the industrial lights, his bespoke-tailored suit a stark, surreal contrast against the heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists to the metal table. His high-priced legal defense team, consisting of former federal prosecutors and Ivy League law professors, immediately constructed a wall of procedural objections, demanding his immediate release on bail and claiming that the state's genetic genealogy methods were a violation of privacy rights. But outside the precinct, the victim's surviving brother stood in the cold rain, his face aged by 31 years of unremitting sorrow, his voice trembling with a volatile mixture of profound relief and burning fury as he addressed the cameras, thanking the detectives who had refused to let his sister's memory be completely erased by the power of the dollar. As the details of the secret investigation began to leak to the investigative journalists of the city, the sheer calculated coldness of Julian Vance's double life began to paint a picture of a predator far more dangerous, far more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined. Files from the 1995 archive revealed that the Vance family had subtly donated massive sums of money to the university, where the victims studied immediately after the homicide, a financial maneuver that modern investigators now viewed as a deliberate attempt to buy the institution's silence and prevent a campus-led push for a wider corporate investigation. Forensic behaviorists began to re-examine other unresolved disappearances of young women along the eastern seaboard between 1995 and 2010, realizing that an individual with access to private jets, offshore properties, and unlimited liquid capital could have operated as a transient serial predator for decades without ever drawing a single glance from local law enforcement. The paper cup left behind in the luxury hotel lobby became a symbol of poetic, unyielding justice, a mundane, disposable item of consumption that held the ultimate key to unlocking a vault of secrets that Julian Vance believed he would carry into his family's historic mausoleum. The upcoming legal proceedings promised to be the most sensational, explosive trial in the history of the Massachusetts court system, a direct, high-stakes confrontation between the absolute precision of modern forensic science and the deeply entrenched networks of old money power. Legal analysts filling the cable news blocks explained that the state's case was virtually bulletproof from a scientific standpoint, as the investigative genetic genealogy had traced the DNA profile through multiple independent family branches before locking onto Julian's specific genetic signature. In the neighborhoods of South Boston and Dorchester, the atmosphere grew increasingly toxic as the public watched the defense team attempt to suppress the DNA evidence on technical grounds, sparking massive, daily protests outside the courthouse where citizens demanded that the billionaire's son be treated with the same unyielding severity as any common criminal. The historic social clubs of Beacon Hill became ghost towns, their mahogany doors locked, their elite members refusing to comment to reporters, terrified that Julian's defense might involve pulling back the curtain on the private vices and cover-ups of the city's entire upper class. The older residents of the city, those who remembered the victim's vibrant, artistic spirit and her dreams of gallery exhibitions in New York, felt a heavy sense of vindication mixed with profound, historical anger, knowing that 31 years of delayed justice was a tragedy that could never be truly compensated. When the heavy oak doors of the courtroom finally opened for the trial's commencement, the tension inside the chamber was thick enough to suffocate, packed to absolute capacity with journalists, legal experts, and true crime observers from around the globe. The defendant entered the room stripped of his elite armor, no longer the untouchable heir to a global fortune, but an aging prisoner of the state of Massachusetts, his face pale, his silver hair unkempt, and his eyes staring blankly at the floor to avoid the burning, furious gazes of the victim's family. The prosecution opened its case with a devastating, cinematic narrative, reconstructing the final hours of the art student's life in 1995 and contrasting her struggle for survival with Julian's subsequent decades of unmitigated luxury, travel, and social adulation. They presented the physical evidence with a clinical, surgical care, walking the jury through the immaculate condition of the preserved nylon cord, the absolute lack of external contamination, and the mathematical impossibility of the DNA matching anyone else on the planet. The most harrowing moment of the trial occurred when the state introduced a series of private journals recovered from Julian's offshore estate, journals written in a complex cipher that, when decoded by federal cryptographers, revealed a detailed, cold-blooded chronicle of predatory fantasies and a complete lack of human empathy that shocked even the veteran homicide detectives in the room. The trial progressed through a series of stunning, daily revelations, including testimony from a former private security guard who confessed that he had been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by the Vance Family Foundation in 1996 to destroy a logbook that placed Julian's private vehicle near the Commonwealth Avenue alleyway on the night of the murder. This testimony sent a shockwave of legal exposure through the corporate offices of the family empire, demonstrating that the cover-up had been an active, ongoing conspiracy that involved multiple layers of the billionaire's corporate structure. The defense team, realizing that an acquittal on the merits was a scientific impossibility, shifted their strategy toward an insanity defense, bringing in highly paid psychiatrists to argue that Julian suffered from a profound, dissociative personality disorder that rendered him incapable of understanding the nature of his actions in 1995. This final, desperate maneuver was met with universal derision from the public and was systematically dismantled by the prosecution's cross-examination, which showed that Julian's meticulous efforts to clean the crime scene and systematically cover his tracks for 31 years were the actions of an incredibly rational, highly disciplined, and deeply malevolent mind. As the historic trial drew to a close, the entire city of Boston seemed to hold its breath, the bustling streets surrounding the courthouse falling into a tense, expectant quiet as the jury retired to deliberate the fate of the city's fallen prince. The deliberation was brief, lasting less than 4 hours, a definitive indication that the 12 ordinary citizens had chosen the unyielding truth of forensic science over the expensive illusions of the defense team. The courtroom erupted into a wall of raw emotion as the foreperson read the word, "guilty" on all counts, a sound that brought the victim's brother to his knees in tears, while Julian Vance remained entirely motionless, his face a dead mask of absolute, frozen denial as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The spectacular fall of the billionaire's son stood as a permanent, historic warning to the elite of the world, a definitive demonstration that time, wealth, and power are entirely useless shields when the modern science of genetic genealogy finally drags the hidden sins of the past into the burning light of justice. The heavy, historic gates of the state penitentiary clicked shut behind Julian Vance, marking the permanent, unyielding end of a 31-year run from a shadow that he believed he had outrun in the foggy streets of 1995. The corporate offices of the Vance financial empire were systematically dismantled by federal regulators in the months following the verdict, their assets liquidated to pay for the massive civil judgments awarded to the victim's surviving family, ensuring that the fortune used to conceal the crime was completely destroyed by the hand of justice. The Commonwealth Avenue alleyway, once a dark site of permanent tragedy and unresolved horror, was transformed by the local community into a beautiful public memorial garden, its stone arches covered in vibrant murals painted by local art students, a space dedicated to the celebration of life, creativity, and the ultimate triumph of truth over institutional power. The case became a global template for modern cold case units, proving that no matter how old the crime, no matter how powerful the perpetrator, and no matter how deep the cover-up was buried in the structures of high society, the biological signature of a killer remains an indelible mark that will eventually demand a full, absolute reckoning before the bar of human justice. The cold wind still sweeps off the Atlantic Ocean, cutting through the historic streets of Beacon Hill and rattling the windows of the brownstones where Julian Vance once dined with the rulers of the city, but the suffocating atmosphere of institutional protection and unresolved mystery has finally lifted from the district. The people of Boston no longer look at the historic skyline with a sense of lingering, cynical doubt. Instead, the city has become a monument to the unyielding reality that under the modern rule of law, a paper cup left on a counter can bring an empire to its knees. The name of the young art student is no longer a whispered warning in the university dormitories, but a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the light of truth can pierce even the thickest vaults of old money and generational privilege. As the sun sets over the Charles River, casting long, golden reflections against the glass structures of a modern city, the family of the victim can finally sleep with a sense of absolute security, knowing that the monster who stalked their youth is dying in a concrete cell, and that their 31-year dark night has finally, definitively come to an end. The systematic deconstruction of the Vance dynasty did not stop at the prison gates. It triggered a massive, statewide audit of every charitable foundation and corporate trust that had been linked to the family name for over half a century. Forensic accountants working alongside federal investigators uncovered a complex web of offshore shell companies and high-value real estate transfers that had been utilized not only to fund Julian's luxurious international lifestyle, but to maintain a permanent retainership of elite private investigators whose sole purpose was to monitor law enforcement databases for any mention of the 1995 homicide. The sheer corporate scale of this operational security network shocked the legal establishment, revealing that the defense of a billionaire's son was an ongoing, multi-million-dollar industry designed to suppress the truth through a combination of economic intimidation and sophisticated legal positioning. Every building that bore the Vance family name became a site of intense public protest, forcing university boards and hospital trustees to vote unanimously to strip the plaques from the walls, erasing the predator's legacy from the public architecture of New England in real time. Inside the high-security block of the maximum security facility, Julian Vance quickly discovered that his family's wealth was entirely useless in an ecosystem governed by the brutal, unyielding rules of survival and institutional routine. Stripped of his tailored garments, his personal assistants, and the absolute deference of his corporate subordinates, he was reduced to a simple number on a state manifest, his days marked by the monotonous clanging of steel doors, the cold quality of institutional food, and the constant, vigilant monitoring of the guards assigned to prevent his suicide. Prison reports leaked to the investigative press indicated that the former Prince of Beacon Hill spent his isolation hours pacing the tiny perimeter of his concrete cell, completely unable to adapt to a reality where he could not buy his way out of a room or dictate the behavior of the human beings around him. His high-priced lawyers continued to file automated appeals in the state appellate courts, but the legal community knew these motions were nothing more than the dying gasps of an extinct financial empire, completely incapable of altering the mathematical reality of the DNA evidence that had sealed his fate. The broader cultural impact of the Boston verdict resonated through cold case squads across the continental United States, inspiring a massive wave of funding for investigative genetic genealogy units in hundreds of small, under-resourced police departments that had previously lacked the capital to pursue their oldest mysteries. Law enforcement agencies realized that the Vance conviction had established a powerful legal precedent, validating the use of public genealogy databases to track high-value targets who had previously used their social status and political influence to remain completely invisible to traditional detective work. The white paper cup that had brought down Julian Vance was placed in a permanent training exhibit at the FBI Academy in Quantico, a stark, physical reminder to future generations of federal agents that the most powerful weapon in the modern arsenal of justice is not a tactical rifle or a surveillance drone, but the invisible, indelible biological signature that every human being leaves behind on the mundane objects of everyday life. In the quiet, working-class neighborhoods where the victim's family had spent 31 years nursing their private, unmitigated grief, the finality of the court's judgment brought a profound, almost holy sense of peace that transformed their relationship with the city. The victim's brother established a permanent scholarship fund in his sister's name, utilizing the liquidated assets of the Vance Foundation to provide full tuitions for young, aspiring artists from impoverished backgrounds, ensuring that her creative spirit would continue to live on through the work of future generations. The annual vigil held at the Commonwealth Avenue Memorial Garden became a celebration of community solidarity, a place where the families of other unresolved cold case victims gathered to find hope, strength, and the unyielding conviction that no mystery is entirely permanent when science and determination refuse to surrender. The shadows of 1995 have finally been chased out of the alleys of Beacon Hill, replaced by the clean, bright reality of a city that refused to let its moral fabric be entirely corrupted by the arrogance of a billionaire's fortune. The story of Julian Vance's capture remains a definitive chapter in the history of New Boston, a modern myth of scientific inevitability that proves that the arc of the moral universe may be long, but it bends with absolute, geometric precision toward justice when the code of life itself steps into the witness box. As the winter snow begins to fall over the common, blanketing the historic statues and the stone pavers in a clean, quiet coat of white, the memory of the young art student remains perfectly preserved, a brilliant, artistic light that outlasted the dark structures of old money and brought a monster to his definitive knees. To fully comprehend how the golden child of one of New England's most formidable dynasties could evade the shadow of a state executioner for over 3 decades, one must dissect the anatomy of Boston's social elite during the mid-1990s. This was not merely a world of immense liquid capital. It was a carefully fortified ecosystem designed to process, manage, and ultimately suppress any internal anomaly that threatened the collective reputation of the ruling class. When 21-year-old Emily Sterling vanished into the freezing, moisture-heavy air of that November night, her sudden absence did not trigger the immediate, aggressive tactical response that a modern observer might expect. Instead, it initiated a sequence of institutional deflections, corporate maneuvers, and subtle legal roadblocking that allowed Julian Vance to return to his family's multi-million-dollar brownstone, wash the microscopic debris of a brutal crime from beneath his manicured fingernails, and step seamlessly back into the high-stakes world of international real estate speculation. The initial investigation conducted by the Boston Police Department in the winter of 1995 was severely hampered by a combination of technological limitations and systemic deference to old money institutions. The detectives assigned to the case were operating in an era before widespread high-definition closed-circuit television networks, before cellular triangulation data, and before the existence of automated digital forensics. The alleyway behind the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens, where Emily's body was precisely arranged, was treated not with the clinical, uncontaminated protocols of a modern crime laboratory, but with the chaotic, open-air processing common to rural precincts of the time. Dozens of uniform officers, utility workers, and early media correspondents walked through the perimeter, tracking urban debris across the stone pavers, and inadvertently creating a cloud of historical static that obscured the physical reality of the perpetrator's actions. The discovery of the military-grade nylon cord should have narrow-focused the investigative lens toward individuals with tactical maritime backgrounds, private security clearances, or elite athletic training. All profiles that perfectly matched the young, hyper-athletic Julian Vance, who was an avid deep-sea yachtsman and a frequent guest at specialized military-style training compounds in northern New England. However, the moment investigators attempted to cross-reference the chemical signature of the cord with high-end suppliers in the Harbor District, they encountered a wall of absolute resistance. The businesses that catered to the Vance fleet were not accustomed to handing over client registries to local beat detectives, and a series of polite but unyielding letters from prestigious law firms in downtown Boston quickly made it clear that any attempt to enforce subpoenas against members of the Beacon Hill social clubs would result in a prolonged, career-ending bureaucratic warfare within the municipal court system. This subtle, multi-layered insulation was orchestrated not through explicit bribes or cinematic back-alley threats, but through the normal, everyday machinery of class solidarity. The Vance Family Foundation was a major contributor to the Police Relief Fund, a primary donor to municipal development initiatives, and held deep personal relationships with the state's executive branch. When a detective got too close to asking Julian about his whereabouts on the night of November 12th, a subtle call would be made from a corporate office to a political office, and then down through the chain of command to the precinct captain. The narrative would shift. Resources would be redirected toward the transient population of the train stations, and the focus would be systematically steered away from the pristine, locked brownstones of the elite and onto the familiar, unprotected targets of urban poverty. For 31 years, this protective amnesia allowed Julian Vance to live an existence of unimaginable privilege, building a global profile as a visionary philanthropist and an indispensable asset to New England's cultural institutions. He assumed the chairmanship of the family's international banking interests, traveled on private corporate transport between New York, London, and the Swiss Alps, and continued to attend charity galas where he spoke passionately about the necessity of historical preservation and civic responsibility. He grew older with the elegant, silver-hair distinction common to men who have never known the stress of physical insecurity or financial vulnerability, completely convinced that the cold stone alleyway on Commonwealth Avenue was a distant, irrelevant dream that had been permanently erased by the passage of time and the power of the dollar. But the architecture of the modern digital landscape was silently evolving, preparing a trap that Julian's old money defense systems were entirely unequipped to anticipate. By the mid-2020s, the field of forensic genomics had advanced far beyond the primitive restriction fragment length polymorphism testing of the 1990s. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy completely bypassed the limitations of the traditional state and federal criminal databases. Forensic technicians no longer required a direct profile match in the National CODIS network. They could take the degraded, microscopic skin cells that had remained trapped inside the synthetic fibers of the nylon cord for 31 years, amplify the DNA using high-throughput sequencing technology, and build a comprehensive genetic blueprint consisting of hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms. When the Specialized Federal Cold Case Unit uploaded this ultra-precise genetic profile to public, open-source ancestry databases in early 2026, the software did not return Julian Vance's name. Instead, it generated a vast, multi-dimensional web of familial connections that stretched across the historic settlements of New England, mapping out a lineage of governors, judges, and shipping magnates whose descendants had contributed their DNA to genealogy websites in search of their European roots. The genetic genealogist assigned to the task force spent weeks navigating this digital maze, tracking the intersections of paternal and maternal lines, calculating the exact centimorgan values of distant cousins, and working backward to find the common ancestors who had walked the streets of Boston a century earlier. As the genealogical tree began to take shape on the digital whiteboards of the task force room, the branches naturally withered away when cross-referenced with the hard, historical realities of the 1995 crime scene. The suspect had to be male, had to be of a specific age range in the mid-1990s, and most critically, had to possess unrestricted, unmonitored access to the highly exclusive perimeter of the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens on that specific freezing Sunday night. One by one, the names of corporate executives, retired academics, and overseas expatriates were crossed off the ledger in red ink, leaving a single, undeniable branch of the tree that terminated at the name of Julian Vance. The moment that name was circled, an immediate, suffocating tension enveloped the federal cold case squad. They were not dealing with a typical street predator or a long-dead transient whose memory could be easily confronted. They were looking at a living prince of the American financial establishment, a man who possessed an army of corporate attorneys, public relations specialists, and political allies who could destroy an investigation before a single indictment could be unsealed. The task force knew that traditional investigative methods, such as conducting voluntary interviews or executing standard search warrants at his Beacon Hill residence, would instantly trigger an aggressive corporate defense countermeasure, resulting in the immediate destruction of any supplementary secondary evidence and the permanent flight of the suspect to a non-extradition jurisdiction overseas. They needed his direct, unrefined biological material to perform a one-to-one forensic comparison against the profile extracted from the 1995 nylon cord, and they had to obtain it through a method that was completely legal, entirely covert, and perfectly insulated from any future constitutional challenges under the Fourth Amendment. The surveillance operation that followed was executed with a level of tactical precision that rivaled the actions of an elite intelligence agency. A team of deep cover operatives from out-of-state federal jurisdictions was deployed into the luxury commercial districts of downtown Boston, adjusting their appearances to blend seamlessly into the high-end environments where Julian Vance moved with absolute familiarity. For 3 weeks, these phantom investigators monitored his daily routine, recording the times he left his private office, tracking his movements through the secure parking structures of his real estate firms, and utilizing advanced directional microphones to listen to his interactions with business associates. They watched him with the unyielding patience of hunters, waiting for the single, inevitable moment of carelessness that every human being eventually exhibits during the course of a mundane day. Julian lived with the serene, supreme arrogance of a man who believed his entire life was a fortified castle, completely unaware that every step he took through the public spaces of the city was being watched, calculated, and catalogued by individuals whose sole purpose was his total, historic ruin. The operational breakthrough occurred on a crisp, bright Thursday afternoon inside the majestic, marble-paneled lobby lounge of the Ritz-Carlton overlooking the Boston Common. Julian sat in a secluded velvet booth, conducting a private meeting with an international investment group, his demeanor relaxed and authoritative as he finalized a multi-million-dollar land acquisition project. He ordered a double espresso served in a standard, high-quality ceramic cup, along with a small bottle of premium sparkling water. 2 undercover federal agents sat at an adjacent table, ostensibly reviewing corporate tax documents on their tablets, their attention completely locked on the rim of that espresso cup. When the meeting concluded, Julian stood up, shook hands with the international investors, adjusted his bespoke wool overcoat, and walked confidently out through the revolving glass doors into the afternoon sunshine, leaving the dirty dishes sitting on the polished mahogany table. The moment the glass door clicked shut behind the billionaire's son, one of the undercover operatives slid out of his seat with fluid, natural movement, intercepted a hotel busboy who was approaching the table, and dropped a crisp $100 bill onto his tray, while simultaneously sliding the espresso cup into a sterile, airtight evidence sleeve concealed within his briefcase. The cup was rushed under emergency vehicle escort to the State Forensics Laboratory in Austin, Texas, bypassing local facilities to ensure absolute confidentiality and eliminate any possibility of a leak to the Boston media market. The laboratory technicians worked in continuous, rotating shifts through the night, utilizing advanced lysis buffers to isolate the microscopic epithelial cells left behind by Julian Vance's lower lip on the ceramic rim. By 3:30 a.m., the automated genetic sequencing apparatus had completed its final computational analysis. The results were categorical, absolute, and terrifying in their clarity. The DNA extracted from the Ritz-Carlton espresso cup matched the biological profile found on the 1995 military-grade nylon cord with a mathematical probability of error that was 1 in 11 billion. The decades-old wall of privilege had not just been breached, it had been utterly obliterated by a handful of discarded cells, setting the stage for an explosive, public collision that would change the city of Boston forever. The confirmation of the DNA match transformed the Federal Cold Case Task Force headquarters from a room of quiet speculation into a tactical war room of absolute, high-stakes urgency. The detectives knew that the clock was now ticking against them with a terrifying speed. If a single whisper of the lab results leaked to the Vance family's corporate security network, Julian Vance could board one of his company's private Gulfstream jets at Logan International Airport and be hovering over an international non-extradition zone before a judge could even sign the formal arrest warrant. The decision was made to execute the operation with a sudden, overwhelming force that would completely paralyze the suspect's ability to mount an immediate legal resistance or mobilize his vast political alliances within the state capital. At 5:45 a.m. on a morning wrapped in a freezing, slate-gray Atlantic fog, a convoy of 6 unmarked black tactical SUVs slipped through the quiet, cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, their headlights extinguished to avoid alerting the private neighborhood security details that patrolled the historic district. The vehicles pulled up in front of the massive, iron-gated brick mansion that had belonged to the Vance family since the turn of the 20th century. A team of federal marshals, dressed in heavy body armor with their weapons drawn, breached the ornate front entryway with a clinical, synchronized efficiency that shattered the morning silence of the exclusive enclave. They found Julian Vance in the master suite, dressed in a silk robe, preparing for an early morning conference call with a European banking conglomerate. He did not scream. He did not struggle. He merely stared at the badges of the arresting officers with a look of profound, icy disbelief, his hands trembling slightly as the heavy steel handcuffs were clicked shut around his wrists, marking the definitive, historic collapse of his lifelong immunity. As the news of the arrest broke across the metropolitan media outlets later that morning, the reaction inside the working-class neighborhoods of South Boston, Charlestown, and East Boston was an explosive mixture of shock, vindication, and immediate, burning fury. For 31 years, the public had been fed a continuous narrative that Emily Sterling's murder was the work of a phantom, a transient predator who had slipped into the city on a train and vanished back into the shadows of urban poverty. To suddenly discover that the prime suspect was a prince of the city's financial establishment, a man whose family name was carved into the very institutions where Emily had studied, was a psychological betrayal that threatened to tear the social fabric of Boston apart. The local television stations broke from their regular programming, Broadcasting live from outside the county jail where Julian Vance was being processed, his booking photograph instantly dominating every digital screen in the New England area. The contrast between the elegant, silver-haired philanthropist who had chaired university boards and the grim, orange jumpsuit-clad prisoner sitting in a high-security holding cell created a cognitive dissonance so severe that it completely paralyzed the normal operations of the Beacon Hill social clubs. The historic brownstones behind the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens drew their curtains tight, their elite residents refusing to answer the doors for the swarms of investigative journalists who had descended upon the district, terrified that any statement could connect them to the unfolding corporate scandal. The Vance financial empire immediately went into a state of total, defensive lockdown, releasing a curt, legally sanitized press statement asserting Julian's absolute innocence and claiming that the charges were the result of a politically motivated, scientifically flawed investigation designed to tarnish a legacy of profound civic charity. But while the corporate public relations teams attempted to manage the public fallout, a team of specialized forensic accountants and federal investigators was already executing a series of sweeping search warrants at the Vance Family Foundation offices and Julian's private offshore estate in Newport, Rhode Island. Inside a climate-controlled vault in the basement of his coastal mansion, detectives discovered a collection of items that completely dismantled the defense's narrative of an innocent family caught in a web of forensic errors. Locked inside a heavy, titanium-reinforced safe were not stock certificates or bearer bonds, but a series of highly classified, internal corporate dossiers dating back to the winter of 1995. The files revealed that within 72 hours of Emily Sterling's murder, the Vance family's private security firm, staffed by retired high-ranking intelligence officers, had conducted a comprehensive, internal investigation that had identified Julian's involvement in the crime. Instead of turning the evidence over to the Boston Police Department, the corporation had utilized a multi-million-dollar fund to systematically neutralize any potential vulnerabilities in his alibi. The documents included receipts for anonymous cash transfers to a former parking garage attendant who had initially reported seeing Julian's vehicle near the Commonwealth Avenue alleyway on the night of the homicide, along with detailed logs monitoring the movements of the original homicide detectives assigned to the case. The realization that the billionaire's family had actively managed a corporate cover-up operation for over 3 decades sent a wave of legal exposure through the entire financial institution, prompting the state's attorney general to initiate a parallel grand jury investigation into corporate complicity and obstruction of justice. The legal machinery began to turn with a terrifying, unyielding speed as prosecutors prepared a capital murder indictment that would rely not just on the infallible nature of the genetic genealogy match, but on a physical paper trail of corporate corruption that proved a lifelong consciousness of guilt. Julian Vance was no longer facing a simple, historical cold case. He was facing a modern, comprehensive prosecution that was prepared to tear down his entire family empire to achieve a total, absolute victory in the name of justice. Inside the interrogation room, beneath the harsh, unblinking glare of the fluorescent lights, Julian sat in absolute silence, his hands clasped on the cold metal table, his high-priced legal team flanking him like a defensive phalanx. His lead attorney, a legendary white-collar defense specialist from New York, launched an immediate, aggressive challenge against the legality of the DNA collection from the Ritz-Carlton espresso cup, arguing that the undercover operation constituted an unconstitutional, warrantless search of abandonment. The defense team was attempting to create a shield of procedural technicalities, hoping to suppress the scientific evidence before it could ever be displayed to a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. But the prosecution remained completely unfazed, confident that the legal precedents surrounding discarded garbage and public abandonment were unyielding, leaving the billionaire's son with no viable escape route other than to sit in his cell and watch the golden structure of his life systematically dissolve before his eyes. The legal strategy of the defense team became fully visible during the highly anticipated arraignment hearing at the Suffolk County Courthouse, a historic stone building that was completely surrounded by barricades and heavily armed state troopers. The defense did not attempt to present an emotional counter-narrative about Julian Vance's character. Instead, they launched a highly technical, aggressive assault on the very foundation of investigative genetic genealogy. They submitted a massive 500-page omnibus motion arguing that the Federal Cold Case Task Force had committed a profound violation of digital privacy rights by using public ancestry databases to track their client without a specific, judicially authorized warrant. They claimed that the state had transformed the private family trees of millions of innocent citizens into an unconstitutional tracking network, attempting to turn the trial into a landmark constitutional showdown that would delay the actual murder proceedings for years. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense as the lead prosecutor stood up to deliver the state's rebuttal. He did not engage in a theoretical debate over digital privacy. Instead, he walked over to the prosecution table and picked up a large, high-definition digital print of the military-grade nylon cord recovered from the 1995 crime scene. He held the image directly in front of the defense table, forcing Julian Vance to look at the physical instrument of Emily Sterling's death. The prosecutor argued with a cold, absolute clarity that a citizen has no expectation of privacy in the skin cells they violently leave behind on the body of a murder victim, nor do they possess any property rights over a paper cup discarded in a public hotel lobby. He stated that the science of genetic genealogy was not a violation of rights, but an amplification of the truth, an infallible lens that allowed the state to look through 31 years of calculated deception and identify the exact biological signature of a predator. The judge's ruling was swift, decisive, and catastrophic for the defense. In a detailed oral opinion delivered from the bench, she denied the defense's motion to suppress the DNA evidence, stating that the law was entirely settled regarding abandoned property and that public genealogy databases operated under clear, voluntary terms of service that allowed for law enforcement cross-referencing in cases of violent crime. The denial struck the defense table like a physical blow, stripping Julian Vance of his primary constitutional shield and forcing his high-priced legal team to confront the reality that they would have to defend a billionaire's son against a perfect scientific match before a jury of 12 ordinary, working-class Boston citizens. With the procedural roadblocks removed, the state began the process of laying out its witness list, a sequence of individuals that would systematically connect the corporate cover-up to the physical reality of the 1995 homicide. The first witness called to the stand when the evidentiary hearings commenced was Dr. Alastair Finch, a retired forensic pathologist who had performed the original autopsy on Emily Sterling in November of 1995. Finch, a man whose hair had turned entirely white over the decades, spoke with a clinical, unyielding precision that filled the courtroom with a grim, suffocating quiet. As the prosecution projected the original, faded color photographs of the crime scene onto the large screens, Finch walked the jury through the exact mechanics of the victim's injuries. He pointed out the highly specific, symmetrical nature of the bindings on Emily's wrists, explaining that the knots used to secure the military-grade nylon cord were not the random, panicked work of a street mugger. They were highly sophisticated, professional maritime knots known as a double sheet bend, a technique used almost exclusively by high-end blue-water competitive yachtsmen to secure heavy rigging under extreme storm conditions. The prosecutor immediately entered into evidence Julian Vance's international yachting registries from 1995, showing that not only was he a certified master of blue water navigation, but that his private vessel, the Beacon, had won a prestigious transatlantic race just 3 months prior to the murder using that exact specific brand and weight of nylon cordage. The cross-examination of the retired pathologist was a brutal, clinical exercise in modern defense tactics, with the defense attorney relentlessly targeting the age and degradation of the physical evidence. He forced Dr. Finch to admit that the cardboard box containing the nylon cord had been stored in an old municipal facility that lacked modern climate control systems for nearly a decade before being transferred to the federal task force. The defense produced internal police logs showing that the facility had suffered a steam pipe rupture in 1999, suggesting that the heat and moisture could have compromised the integrity of the biological material or allowed for the microscopic transfer of Julian Vance's DNA from other high society items that had been handled by the department during unrelated civic functions. But the prosecution was prepared for this strategy, and their next witness was designed to build an unbreakable bridge of scientific certainty that no amount of historical static could obscure. They called to the stand Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the lead molecular biologist who had directed the high-definition sequencing of the touched DNA at the State Genomics Laboratory. Dr. Jenkins used clear, accessible language to explain the concept of single nucleotide polymorphism sequencing to the jury, explaining that modern forensics does not merely look at superficial genetic markers. It reads the entire, unvarnished blueprint of a human being's identity. Using a massive digital chart that filled the front wall of the courtroom, Dr. Jenkins demonstrated that the biological material recovered from the core of the nylon cord was not the result of environmental contamination or superficial transfer. The skin cells were deeply embedded into the twisted synthetic fibers of the rope, deposited under extreme physical pressure, the exact mechanical pressure required to violently bind a victim's hands. She showed that the probability of that specific genetic profile belonging to any other individual on the planet was 1 in 11 billion, an astronomical number that effectively rendered the defense's theories of contamination or conspiracy scientifically impossible. As the scientific precision of her testimony settled over the room, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the defense table. Julian Vance sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the digital display, his face a pale, frozen mask that refused to give away the panic that must have been rising within him. He was a man who had spent his entire life utilizing the power of language, wealth, and social prestige to control every environment he stepped into, but he was now facing an adversary that could not be bought, could not be preached to, and could not be intimidated by his family's historical legacy. The science was cold, indifferent, and absolute, and it was systematically stripping away his armor, piece by piece, before the eyes of the city he had deceived for 31 years. The trial took an even more dramatic turn when the prosecution introduced the evidence recovered from the secure vault of Julian's Newport estate. The district attorney called to the stand Special Agent David Vance, no relation to the defendant, the federal investigator who had led the team that breached the safe. Agent Vance walked the jury through the recovery of the internal corporate dossiers from 1995, reading aloud the cold, calculated memos written by the family's private security firm. The documents detailed how the family had systematically monitored the police investigation, identifying vulnerable points in the precinct's leadership and using targeted financial donations to ensure that the focus of the homicide squad remained firmly fixed on the transient populations of the city. The realization that the Vance financial empire had treated the murder of a 21-year-old student as a corporate liability to be managed and suppressed sent a shockwave of profound moral outrage through the gallery. David Sterling, Emily's surviving brother, sat in the front row, his hands clenched into tight fists, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the clinical descriptions of how his sister's justice had been actively bought and sold by the billionaires of Beacon Hill. The illusion of the town's innocence was gone forever, replaced by the grim, unvarnished reality that the monster they had feared for decades wasn't a shadow from the slums, but a man who used his corporate wealth as a license to destroy human life with absolute impunity. The exposure of the internal corporate dossiers from the Newport safe acted as a permanent catalyst for the trial, shifting the battlefield from the sterile accuracy of DNA sequencing to the dark, calculated reality of a multi-million-dollar structural cover-up. When the court reconvened for the fifth day of testimony, the line of citizens waiting to enter the gallery stretched completely down the marble corridors of the Suffolk County Courthouse and out into the freezing city square. The prosecution had already established the forensic link. Now, they were preparing to introduce the human cost of the Vance family's structural protection apparatus. They called to the stand a witness whose unexpected presence drew a sharp, sudden movement from Julian Vance, a reaction so violent it caused his high-priced defense attorneys to firmly grasp his shoulder to keep him from standing up. The witness was Arthur Pendleton, a 72-year-old retired corporate security director who had spent 30 years operating in the deep, unmonitored shadows of the Vance family's global real estate and banking empire. Pendleton walked with the rigid, calculated discipline of a former military intelligence officer, his voice carrying a flat, unblinking authority through the courtroom microphones. He did not ask for immunity, nor did he look toward the defense table. He simply adjusted his glasses and began reading from a series of personal, handwritten logbooks that he had maintained throughout his career as an insurance policy against the very dynasty he had served. Pendleton testified that on the afternoon of November 13, 1995, less than 12 hours after Emily Sterling's body was discovered in the Commonwealth Avenue alleyway, he was summoned to a private, emergency meeting at the Vance family offices in downtown Boston. Present in the room were Julian Vance, his billionaire philanthropist father, and the senior partners of the family's prestigious corporate law firm. Pendleton told the jury that Julian was sitting in the corner of the office, his expensive wool coat missing, his hands covered in deep, raw scratches that he claimed were the result of a sudden accident on his private yacht. But the corporate leadership didn't ask questions about the scratches. They didn't ask about his whereabouts on the night of November 12th. Instead, they handed Pendleton a highly confidential assignment. He was ordered to utilize a specialized, off-the-books corporate intelligence fund to immediately purchase and take control of every single security videotape from the commercial parking structures, private residential brownstones, and local retail shops that overlooked the entire perimeter of the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens. The prosecution projected scanned copies of Pendleton's original financial ledgers onto the screens, showing a series of cash withdrawals totaling over $400,000 executed within 48 hours of the homicide. The jury watched in absolute, stunned silence as Pendleton detailed how he had systematically tracked down a private night watchman who had recorded high-definition footage of a luxury dark sedan matching Julian's vehicle idling near the mouth of the alleyway during the exact hours of the abduction. Pendleton testified that he personally delivered an envelope containing $50,000 in cash to the watchman's residence, along with a signed, non-disclosure agreement prepared by the family's corporate attorneys and a clear, unvarnished warning that any future interaction with the Boston Police Department would result in the immediate, total destruction of his family's economic livelihood. The systematic erasure of the physical evidence was executed with a clinical, corporate efficiency that bypassed the traditional channels of local law enforcement entirely. Pendleton explained that the tapes weren't burned or discarded. They were brought directly to the main corporate vault, where they were subjected to an industrial degaussing process that permanently erased the magnetic oxide layer, leaving behind hours of blank, useless static. The realization that a billionaire's son could command an entire corporate infrastructure to sanitize a murder scene while Emily's working-class family was still identifying her body in the municipal morgue sent a wave of profound, suffocating revulsion through the 12 ordinary citizens sitting in the jury box. When the lead defense attorney rose for the cross-examination, his strategy was a desperate, scorched-earth attempt to destroy Pendleton's credibility by painting him as a corrupt, bitter ex-employee who was fabricating a spectacular conspiracy to secure a lucrative true crime book contract. He relentlessly questioned Pendleton about his financial history, pointing out that he had been quietly dismissed from the Vance Corporation in 2018 following an internal dispute regarding unauthorized expenditures. The attorney stood directly in front of the witness stand, shouting that Pendleton was a professional extortionist who had spent decades collecting gossip and falsifying documents to hold over the heads of his wealthy employers. But Pendleton remained completely unbothered by the theatrical aggression of the defense. He leaned forward, looked the attorney directly in the eyes, and revealed a secondary, hidden repository of evidence that the defense team had completely failed to anticipate during their pretrial discoveries. He stated with a calm, flat precision that before he ran the original surveillance tapes through the corporate degaussing machine in 1995, he had utilized a private, high-fidelity digital formatting deck to create a series of backup copies that he had kept sealed inside a secure, temperature-controlled safety deposit box in a non-affiliated bank in Montreal, Canada. The announcement struck the courtroom like a physical explosion. The prosecutor immediately turned to the judge, presenting a formal, internationally verified affidavit confirming that the Federal Cold Case Task Force had successfully retrieved the Montreal safety deposit box just 72 hours prior to the start of the trial. The state requested permission to immediately introduce the digital conversions of those original 1995 surveillance tapes into the official trial record. Despite a series of frantic, shouting objections from the entire defense phalanx, the judge overruled the motions, ordering the courtroom lights to be extinguished so the jury could view the historical reality of the night Emily Sterling's life was stolen. The large projection screens lit up with the grainy, monochrome resolution of a 1995 security camera overlooking the rear entrance of the private club where Emily worked. The timestamp on the bottom of the video read 10:14 p.m. The jury watched as the young art student stepped out into the freezing Atlantic fog, her coat buttoned tight, her face illuminated briefly by the street lamp as she walked toward the train platform. Seconds later, a dark luxury sedan with a distinctive, high-end custom rim profile, the exact rim profile registered to Julian Vance's private collection, pulled smoothly away from the curb, trailing her movements with a slow, predatory calculation that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. The camera footage from a secondary angle showed the vehicle accelerating smoothly as Emily turned down the historic street toward the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens, its headlights suddenly extinguishing as it glided into the shadows behind her. The visualization of the hunt, the sheer, cold-blooded premeditation captured on a tape that had been hidden in a Canadian vault for 31 years, obliterated the defense's remaining theories of contamination, coincidence, or investigative error. Julian Vance sat at the table, his head bowed, his hands pressing into his temples as the flickering light of his own vehicle reflected across his pale, sweat-sheened face, exposing him definitively to the community he had manipulated as a monster who had finally run out of places to hide. The introduction of the backup surveillance footage from the Montreal safety deposit box shattered the final legal fortifications of the defense, shifting the courtroom from a space of tactical argumentation into a theater of inescapable historical truth. When the lights in room 302 flickered back on after the video presentation, the silence was so heavy that the rhythmic humming of the digital projectors sounded like an engine room in the quiet chamber. The jurors did not look at the defense table. Their eyes were fixed on the screen where the grainy, monochrome silhouette of Julian Vance's luxury sedan had just been shown hunting a 21-year-old student through the freezing fog of 1995. The prosecution had successfully woven the microscopic precision of modern DNA with the macroscopic reality of physical video evidence, but they were not finished driving home the absolute finality of their case. The lead district attorney called to the stand Special Agent Christopher Vance, no relation to the defendant, a veteran digital forensics and data recovery specialist with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Crimes Division. Agent Vance was a young, sharp-eyed technician who approached the witness stand carrying a series of heavily encrypted, militarized external hard drives. He adjusted his glasses, took the oath, and began to outline the results of a comprehensive digital autopsy performed on the personal computers, secure servers, and early digital storage systems seized from Julian Vance's private office during the January 2026 raid. Agent Vance explained to the jury that while the public view of computer technology in 1995 was primitive, the private corporate infrastructure of the Vance financial empire was already utilizing early forms of proprietary, high-security network databases to manage their global assets and internal communications. When Julian Vance was integrated into the senior leadership of the family firm in the late 1990s, he had been assigned an exclusive, terminal-locked workstation that featured an early form of automated, magnetic tape backup storage designed to preserve every keystroke, every internal memo, and every deleted file for regulatory compliance. The defense team immediately lodged a series of frantic objections, claiming that the extraction of files from obsolete, 30-year-old corporate backup tapes was highly unreliable, prone to systemic digital corruption, and constituted a violation of trade secret protections. They argued that the state was attempting to introduce fragmented, unverified electronic data that could have been modified or injected by disgruntled IT contractors over the intervening decades. But the prosecution countered with a clinical, unyielding technological foundation, demonstrating that the cryptographic hash values of the recovered files matched the original system architecture perfectly, proving that the data had remained completely unaltered since it was first written to the magnetic core in the winter of 1995. The judge overruled the objections, and Agent Vance was permitted to display the decrypted directories to the jury. The screen filled with a series of scanned text files and internal emails that had been recovered from the deep, unindexed sectors of the old Vance corporate network, files that Julian Vance believed had been permanently vaporized when the company modernized its servers in the early 2000s. The entries revealed a level of calculated, cold-blooded psychopathy that caused several members of the audience to audibly gasp. The prosecution displayed an internal electronic memo dated December 4, 1995, sent from a private, encrypted terminal account registered directly to Julian Vance. The recipient was a high-ranking corporate liaison who managed the family's real estate holdings in the Harbor District. In the memo, written with a chilling, detached corporate syntax, Julian discussed the necessity of expediting the demolition of an old warehouse property located near the train platform where Emily Sterling had walked on the night of her disappearance. He explicitly noted that the construction crew should work through the night to clear the concrete foundations before the municipal homicide squad could obtain a secondary search warrant for the perimeter, framing the destruction of potential secondary evidence as a routine, zoning acceleration. To reinforce this picture of absolute, unvarnished intent, Agent Vance then introduced a series of private, password-protected text documents that had been recovered from an old, handheld digital organizer found inside Julian's childhood desk at the Beacon Hill mansion. These files functioned as a digital diary, written not in prose, but in a cold, alphanumeric shorthand that mapped out the hours leading up to the November 12th homicide. The entries detailed Julian's observations of Emily's work schedule at the private club, his tracking of her typical route to the transit platform, and notes regarding the specific blind spots in the neighborhood's private security patrols. The realization that the billionaire's son had treated the stalk and eventual execution of a young student with the same clinical, strategic planning that he applied to an international corporate acquisition obliterated any remaining pretense of innocence. The defense table sat in a state of visible, paralyzed collapse. Julian Vance did not look up from his hands, his face a tight, gray mask of exhaustion as the digital footprint of his 31-year-old malice was methodically laid bare for the entire city to see. The science of the future had not merely captured his biological signature on a nylon cord. It had reached back through time to pull his most private, hidden thoughts out of the digital ether, leaving him completely exposed before the unyielding judgment of the law. The devastating synthesis of digital archives and historical video footage had systematically stripped the defense of its ability to claim ignorance, accident, or forensic error. When the court opened for the 7th day of formal testimony, the atmosphere inside room 302 had hardened from a state of sensational public curiosity into a clinical, unrelenting march toward a historic judicial reckoning. The prosecution had already established the genetic lock, the physical tracking of the vehicle, and the corporate orchestration of the cover-up. Now, they were preparing to introduce the physical evidence that connected Julian Vance directly to the act of violence itself. They called to the stand Dr. Helen Vance, no relation to the defendant, the chief forensic odontologist and physical anthropologist for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, who had spent months analyzing the microanatomical details preserved in the 1995 archive. Dr. Helen Vance was a soft-spoken, incredibly precise academic who approached the witness stand with a large, leather-bound case containing a series of high-definition 3D dental models and laser-scanned structural overlays. She adjusted her microphone, looked directly into the jury box, and began to detail an aspect of Emily Sterling's autopsy that had remained a complete mystery to the original homicide detectives who had processed the alleyway behind the Commonwealth Avenue Gardens 31 years earlier. She explained that during the initial post-mortem examination in 1995, Dr. Alastair Finch had noted a series of deep, faint indentations on the soft tissue of the victim's left shoulder, marks that were originally dismissed as superficial post-mortem bruising caused by the rough stone pavers of the alley. However, using modern high-resolution multispectral digital imaging and ultraviolet laser fluorescence, Dr. Vance's team had been able to re-examine the preserved skin tissue samples that had been stored in a formalin matrix within the state medical examiner's vault. The ultraviolet light did not reveal random bruising. It brought to the surface a highly specific, semicircular pattern of microfractures in the dermal layers, the undeniable, biological signature of a human bite mark inflicted during the final seconds of the victim's struggle for survival. The prosecution immediately projected a massive, high-contrast digital rendering of the pattern onto the courtroom screens, showing the individual tooth alignments, the specific incisor spacing, and a distinct, irregular fracture on the left canine. The courtroom collective held its breath as Dr. Vance produced a secondary model, A digital cast of Julian Vance's dental profile obtained by federal marshals during his processing at the high-security detention facility in January of 2026. Using an advanced forensic software program developed for international human rights investigations, she initiated a real-time, geometric overlay of the two profiles on the digital screen. The jury watched in absolute, paralyzed fascination as the digital cast of the billionaire's son glided across the screen and clicked into the 1995 bite mark with a mathematical precision that was flawless. The irregular fracture on Julian's left canine matched the microdermal tear in Emily's skin with a structural certainty that bypassed any need for statistical interpretation. It was a physical lock, an anatomical key that proved he had laid his teeth upon her flesh in the darkness of that freezing November night. The lead defense attorney rose for his cross-examination with a visible sense of desperation, launching into a highly aggressive, technical assault on the entire field of forensic odontology. He stood close to the witness box, citing multiple academic studies and federal reports from the early 2010s that criticized bite mark analysis as an unreliable, subjective science that had led to numerous wrongful convictions in the past. He argued that soft tissue stretches, decomposes, and warps over 31 years inside a formalin jar, making any modern digital overlay a manufactured illusion designed to fit the prosecution's narrative rather than a reflection of historical reality. He demanded to know how Dr. Vance could look a jury in the eye and claim a match when the human skin is one of the most unstable recording mediums in the natural world. But Dr. Vance remained completely unmoved by the theatrical anger of the defense. She leaned forward, adjusted her glasses, and clarified that the defense's citations applied strictly to traditional, two-dimensional ink impressions analyzed by the naked eye on living, healing tissue. She explained that her analysis relied on three-dimensional microcomputed tomography, micro-CT, scanning, which maps the permanent structural damage to the underlying deep collagen matrix, a matrix that does not warp or change its geometric properties once preserved in a controlled formalin environment. She stated with a calm, flat authority that the mathematical probability of two unrelated individuals possessing that exact specific incisor alignment and canine fracture profile was 1 in 85 million, effectively rendering the defense's claims of subjective interpretation or historical warping scientifically absurd. As the absolute finality of her testimony settled over the room, a profound, heavy quiet descended upon the defense table. Julian Vance sat perfectly still, his hands tightly clasped together on the polished wood, his face a chalky, sweat-sheened mask that seemed to have aged a decade since the morning his iron gates were breached. He had lived his entire life under the assumption that his wealth could buy a different reality, that his family's social registry could rewrite the rules of consequence, but he was now completely trapped within the unyielding laws of his own biology. The physical components of his body, his skin cells on the cord, his saliva on the coffee cup, and the unique architecture of his teeth had been transformed by modern science into an internal network of witnesses that he could neither bribe, silence, nor destroy, leaving him to sit in his orange jumpsuit and watch the final hours of his freedom systematically slip away. The eighth phase of the trial marked a terrifying descent into the behavioral architecture of the crime, moving the courtroom past the physical evidence of anatomy and into the chillingly cold, operational timeline of the cover-up. When the court reconvened on Monday morning for the start of the third week, the public gallery was so packed that federal marshals had to establish an overflow room on the first floor to accommodate the hundreds of citizens, journalists, and legal scholars who had arrived before dawn. The prosecution had successfully locked Julian Vance to the crime scene through DNA, video surveillance, and micro-CT dental scans. Now, their objective was to demonstrate the immense, calculating consciousness of guilt that followed the murder, revealing a 31-year pattern of economic intimidation and systematic obstruction that turned a wealthy family foundation into an active instrument of criminal concealment. The lead district attorney called to the stand a witness whose name had been kept under the strictest security protocols throughout the entire pretrial discovery process, Marcus Lynn, a 68-year-old former chief technology officer for the Vance Financial Group who had abruptly resigned his lucrative corporate position in the winter of 1996 and vanished into the private residential enclaves of Western Canada. Lynn walked with a slow, hesitant step, his eyes darting anxiously around the high-ceilinged room before settling on the clerk as he took the oath. His voice, thin and strained by decades of self-imposed isolation, carried a raw, emotional vulnerability that stood in sharp contrast to the cold, clinical experts who had preceded him. Lynn testified that in November of 1995, his primary responsibility was to manage the migration of the Vance family's private financial records and internal communications onto a newly developed, encrypted mainframe network that connected their Boston headquarters with their offshore banking facilities in the Cayman Islands. On the morning of November 14th, just 24 hours after Emily Sterling's body was recovered from the Commonwealth Avenue alleyway, Lynn was ordered by Julian's father to create a highly classified, completely segregated subdirectory within the corporate network that was to be completely hidden from traditional IT audits and municipal regulatory inspections. The prosecution carefully guided Lynn's testimony, projecting a series of recovered network architecture blueprints onto the courtroom screens. Lynn pointed out the hidden directory, which had been assigned an obsolete military-grade encryption protocol known simply as Project Anchor. He testified that he was instructed to personally upload a series of digitized text files, audio recordings of private telephone conversations, and high-resolution scans of legal documents directly into this digital vault, documents that had been compiled by the family's private security apparatus as they actively monitored the Boston Homicide Squad's daily progress. The courtroom collective held its breath as the prosecutor opened a specific, decrypted file from the Project Anchor directory, displaying an internal corporate memo dated January 12, 1996. The document, written by a senior partner at the family's high-priced law firm and addressed directly to Julian Vance, contained a detailed, tactical analysis of the political vulnerabilities within the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office at the time. The memo outlines a strategic plan to funnel over $200,000 in anonymous, structured campaign contributions through a network of shell companies to a specific judicial candidate who had promised to quietly reassign the lead detective on the Sterling case if elected. The visualization of this corporate political manipulation, the sheer, unvarnished arrogance of using liquid capital to buy the direction of a murder investigation while Emily's family was still struggling to pay for her funeral, sent a visible wave of fury through the jury box. Several jurors could be seen leaning forward, their faces hardened into expressions of pure, unmitigated contempt as they stared at the defendant. Julian Vance remained completely motionless, his hands folded tightly on his lap, his chin pressed against his chest, as if he could simply block out the electronic records of his family's corrupt dynasty. Lynn's testimony took an even more devastating turn when he described a private confrontation that occurred inside the corporate boardroom in late February of 1996. He told the jury that he had inadvertently intercepted an internal data packet containing a series of high-resolution digital photographs taken by Julian himself on his private yacht in the days following the murder. Photographs that showed a collection of personal items belonging to Emily Sterling, including her missing wallet, her art portfolio sketches, and the distinct silver ring she had been wearing when she left her shift at the private club. Lynn testified that when he confronted Julian about the data packet, the billionaire's son did not offer an explanation, nor did he display a single shred of panic. Instead, Julian walked over to the boardroom window, looked out over the Boston skyline, and told Lynn in a quiet, flat voice that was entirely devoid of human empathy that some individuals were merely transient footnotes in the history of the city, and that those who possessed the capital to shape the skyline were the only ones who truly dictated the terms of reality. Within 48 hours of that conversation, Lynn's corporate credentials were permanently revoked, his pension was frozen, and he was handed a comprehensive severance package that included explicit, binding non-disclosure agreement backed by a clear, unvarnished warning that any future interaction with law enforcement would result in his immediate, total financial ruin. The cross-examination of the former technology director was a brutal, scorched-earth exercise in modern white-collar defense tactics. The lead defense attorney stood close to the witness stand, aggressively targeting Lynn's psychological history and pointing out that he had been treated for severe clinical anxiety and paranoia in the years following his departure from the firm. He suggested that Lynn was a bitter, disgruntled former employee who had spent 30 years magnifying routine corporate compliance procedures into a spectacular, manufactured criminal conspiracy to justify his own professional failures and secure a sense of historical importance. But Lynn did not break under the intense legal pressure. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice suddenly regaining its structural strength, and stated with absolute clarity that his anxiety was not the result of a mental delusion, but the direct, rational consequence of knowing that he had spent decades carrying the digital secrets of a cold-blooded killer who possessed the resources to make an inconvenient witness vanish without a trace. His testimony completely exposed the corporate mechanics of the concealment, demonstrating to the jury that the 31-year wall of silence surrounding Emily Sterling's death was not an accident of history or a failure of police work, but a multi-million-dollar industrial product designed, manufactured, and maintained by the Vance empire to protect their fallen prince from the unyielding scales of human justice. The trial entered its fourth week under a heavy, uniform blanket of coastal fog that rolled off Boston Harbor, matching the grim, unyielding atmosphere that had taken permanent root inside Room 302. The state's case had reached a point of absolute, structural dominance, but the prosecution had one final, devastating avenue of inquiry to explore before resting their presentation. They intended to demonstrate to the jury that Julian Vance's predatory behavior was not an isolated, singular anomaly born of a youthful impulse in 1995, but rather a lifelong, calculated discipline that had been facilitated by his family's vast financial resources and the international mobility afforded by his corporate status. To achieve this, the district attorney called to the stand Special Agent Victoria Vance, no relation to the defendant or the victim, a senior criminal profiler and analyst with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico. Agent Vance was a sharp, clinical expert who approached the witness stand carrying a series of heavily indexed, black leather binders that contain the documented, geographic history of Julian Vance's global movements over a 30-year timeline. The prosecution began by projecting a massive, high-resolution digital map of the Atlantic seaboard and Western Europe onto the courtroom screens, a map that was pristine and white except for a dense network of bright red tracking lines and glowing data points that began to populate the graphic as the agent began to speak. Each point represented a specific date, a specific luxury hotel, a specific marina, or a specific corporate real estate asset where Julian Vance had been documented using private flight logs, credit card receipts, and corporate itinerary archives between the years of 1996 and 2015. The methodology of the FBI's behavioral investigation was a masterclass in modern analytical cross-referencing and database integration. Agent Vance explained that her team had taken Julian's lifetime travel records and laid them directly over the federal VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, database, which catalogs unresolved abductions, missing persons reports, and unsolved sexual homicides across international and state jurisdictions. The objective was to determine if the highly organized, surgical behavioral profile displayed at the Commonwealth Avenue crime scene in 1995 had manifested in other geographic locations where Julian had operated with complete, unmonitored freedom. The results of that digital overlay struck the courtroom like a physical blow, sending a visible wave of shock through the media gallery and causing the defense table to erupt into immediate, frantic activity. Agent Vance walked the jury through 3 specific cold cases located outside the state of Massachusetts, cases that had remained complete mysteries to local authorities for decades but now featured an undeniable, terrifying common denominator: the precise, documented presence of Julian Vance within a 2-mile radius on the exact night the victims vanished. The first data point lit up on the map in the summer of 2002 in the high-end resort enclave of Newport, Rhode Island, where Julian's family owned an extensive coastal estate and where his private yacht, the Beacon, was frequently moored for competitive racing events. A 22-year-old seasonal hospitality worker had vanished late on a Sunday night after leaving her shift at an exclusive waterfront restaurant. Her body was recovered 3 days later from a secluded rocky cove, stripped of her personal clothing, her hands bound with a highly specific brand of synthetic maritime cordage using a double-sheet bend knot, the exact physical signature that Dr. Alastair Finch had documented on Emily Sterling's wrists in 1995. Agent Vance produced corporate dockage logs and private cell phone tower records proving that Julian's vessel had been tied to the adjacent slip on that exact weekend, and that his personal device had connected to the tower overlooking the recovery site during the critical hours of the abduction. As the agent began to detail a second case from the autumn of 2008 in London's exclusive Chelsea district, where Julian had spent 6 weeks finalizing a high-stakes commercial real estate merger, the lead defense attorney jumped to his feet, shouting over the microphones and demanding an immediate mistrial. He argued with immense theatrical fury that the prosecution was attempting to try his client for multiple uncharged, unindicted international homicides without a shred of direct forensic link, using nothing but circumstantial geographic coincidences to poison the minds of the jury and paint an elderly man as a serial monster. The defense was fighting with the frantic energy of men who realized their entire structural defense had been completely hollowed out, but the judge remained entirely unmoved, overruling the objections and instructing the jury that the testimony was being admitted strictly under state legal codes to demonstrate a consistent behavioral pattern, operational method, and absence of mistake. With the defense's objections systematically pushed aside, Agent Vance was permitted to complete her presentation, driving home the ultimate behavioral conclusion of the federal task force. She explained that the profile that emerged from the global data mapping was that of an incredibly disciplined, compartmentalized predator who utilized the extreme privilege of his social class as an active camouflage mechanism. Julian Vance did not hunt in the traditional, high-risk territories common to street predators. He hunted within the spaces where he possessed absolute authority, the private clubs, the elite marinas, and the high-end commercial districts where his family name was etched into the architecture. He operated under the supreme, rational assumption that if any local law enforcement agency ever attempted to look past his corporate shield, his family's wealth would immediately generate a cloud of institutional resistance that would protect him from consequence. The trial took an even more devastating turn when the prosecution called their final witness of the afternoon, Dr. Alan Mercer, a senior forensic digital analyst who had spent months extracting latent geographic metadata from an old, encrypted satellite navigation system recovered from the bridge of Julian's private yacht during the January 2026 raid. Mercer demonstrated to the jury that the navigation computer maintained a deep, hidden system log that recorded the precise GPS coordinates of the vessel's movements during its international voyages in the late 1990s, coordinates that Julian believed had been permanently overwritten by subsequent software updates. The screen filled with a series of blue tracking vectors that mapped out the vessel's precise location on the night of November 14, 1995, less than 24 hours after Emily Sterling's body was discovered in the Boston alleyway. The data revealed that the beacon had slipped out of its secure slip in Boston Harbor at 2 a.m., navigating in total darkness without its transponder active, and had hovered for exactly 45 minutes over a deep, underwater trench located 12 miles off the coast of Massachusetts before returning to port before dawn. The timing and geography of the voyage aligned perfectly with the corporate memos recovered from the Newport safe, providing the jury with a definitive, physical explanation of where Emily's missing personal effects, her art portfolio, and the physical clothing stripped from her body had been permanently disposed of. The mathematical and geographic finality of the state's presentation acted like a massive vice closing around the defense table, stripping Julian Vance of his remaining pretense of innocence and leaving his legal team with no viable strategic options other than to prepare for a closing argument that would rely entirely on a desperate plea for mercy for an old man whose empire of righteousness had turned into a monument of unmitigated horror. The district attorney turned away from the digital screens, looked directly at the 12 men and women in the box, and announced to the calm, flat authority that the state of Massachusetts rested its case, leaving the truth to stand alone in the quiet courtroom. The transition of the trial into its final, decisive phase brought an eerie, clinical stillness to room 302 as the frantic energy of the previous weeks subsided into the solemn reality of closing arguments. The defense team, fully aware that the scientific evidence presented by the prosecution had created a vertical wall of certainty, stood before the jury box not with the aggressive defiance they had displayed at the beginning of the proceedings, but with a somber, almost elegiac tone. The lead defense attorney leaned heavily on the wooden rail, looking directly into the eyes of the 12 men and women who held the fate of Julian Vance in their hands. He did not attempt to relitigate the DNA markers or dispute the chemical signatures recovered from the Newport safe and the Montreal surveillance archives. Instead, he chose to fight on the terrain of human frailty, advanced age, and the philosophical concept of institutional legacy. He argued passionately that the man sitting at the defense table, frail, gray, and visibly diminished, was not the same individual who had allegedly traversed those dark city streets 36 years ago. He painted a picture of a lifetime spent in the service of others, of a man who had built a sanctuary of hope for thousands of broken families through his multi-million-dollar philanthropic foundations, suggesting that a single, distant pocket of darkness should not completely obliterate a subsequent lifetime of undeniable public virtue. The defense was making a calculated, desperate appeal to the deeply ingrained values of the local community, invoking themes of redemption, the fallibility of man, and the necessity of mercy over absolute vengeance. They wanted the jury to see Julian Vance as a tragic, historical paradox, a man who had carried a terrible, private cross for nearly 4 decades while publicly acting as a beacon of light for a city that desperately needed leadership. But when the lead prosecutor rose to deliver the state's final rebuttal, any illusion of sympathy that the defense had managed to cultivate was instantly vaporized by a display of cold, unyielding precision. The district attorney did not speak from the podium. He walked slowly across the floor, stopping just inches from the defense table, pointing a steady, accusing finger directly at the billionaire's son. He told the jury that the defense's argument was the ultimate form of insult to the memory of Emily Sterling and to the intelligence of the community. He argued that Julian Vance's 36 years of philanthropy were not an accumulation of virtue, but rather the most elaborate, calculated act of criminal concealment in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The prosecutor meticulously reconstructed the psychology of the deception, reminding the jury that every financial donation Julian had made to criminal justice reform charities was a weapon used to sanitize his public image, that every corporate shield his family had constructed was a counterintelligence operation designed to monitor the police, and that every dollar he had collected from his global real estate holdings had been used to maintain his freedom and protect his dark, maritime secrets. He displayed the photographs of the military-grade nylon cord one final time, juxtaposing them with images of the majestic limestone buildings that bore the Vance family name across the state. The contrast was devastating, a physical manifestation of a double life so profoundly sociopathic that it left several members of the jury visibly shaken. The state demanded nothing less than a total, unyielding application of the law, asking the jury to return a verdict that would finally dismantle the lie that had held an entire city hostage for a generation. With the closing arguments completed, the judge delivered the formal legal instructions to the jury, outlining the precise statutory requirements for capital murder and emphasizing that their decision must be based solely on the evidence presented within the 4 walls of the courtroom, completely independent of public emotion or media pressure. The 12 men and women filed out of the box and into the deliberation room, and the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, plunging the courthouse into a period of agonizing, breathless suspension. Outside in the historic town square, the crowd that had gathered over the weeks stood in small, quiet circles, the initial anger and noise of the media circus replaced by a somber, reflective anticipation as everyone realized that the long-delayed reckoning was now just a matter of hours away. Inside the courtroom, the silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to compress the 36 years of waiting into a single, unending moment. Julian Vance sat between his attorneys, his face an unreadable, stony mask that refused to give away the internal panic that must have been rising within him as the reality of his situation became undeniable. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, using his wealth to sway thousands of minds, but he was now completely powerless, forced to wait in the silence for a decision that would be made by a group of ordinary citizens he could no longer manipulate. The hours dragged on into the late afternoon, the sun casting long, distorted shadows through the high windows of the courtroom, until finally 3 sharp knocks echoed from the interior of the jury room, signaling that a unanimous decision had been reached. The return of the jury to the box was marked by a complete absence of eye contact with the defense table, a universal indicator that the legal community understood all too well. The judge took his seat, cleared his voice, and requested the verdict forms from the foreperson, a quiet, middle-aged man who handed the documents to the bailiff with a steady, resolute hand. As the judge reviewed the paperwork, ensuring that all legal forms had been correctly executed, the tension in the gallery reached a point of near-physical suffocation, with David Sterling leaning forward against the wooden partition, his eyes locked on the paper that held the final answer to his family's multi-generational nightmare. The judge handed the forms back to the clerk and instructed the defendant to rise and face the jury to hear the final judgment of the state. Julian Vance stood up, smoothing the front of his orange jumpsuit with a slow, deliberate movement that mimicked his old habit of adjusting his tailored jackets before a corporate board meeting, his posture straight, but his eyes fixed firmly on the wall ahead. The clerk's voice, clear and amplified through the courtroom speakers, echoed through the chamber like a tolling bell, reading the formal words that would permanently close the book on the 1995 cold case. We, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty of the offense of capital murder, as charged in the indictment. The courtroom did not erupt in cheers or shouts. Instead, a massive, collective gasp of air escaped from the gallery, a sound of pure, overwhelming emotional release that was instantly accompanied by the quiet, uncontrolled sobbing of the Sterling family as they clung to each other in the front row. The billionaire son of Beacon Hill had been stripped of his titles, his reputation, and his freedom, exposed definitively before the eyes of God and man as a monster who had finally run out of time.